A political plot was forged not in the council chambers, but aimed directly at the royal bed. The Duke of Norfolk used his own flesh and blood as bait. He commanded his daughter to seduce a rapidly decaying, diseased old man. The sole goal was to manipulate the king. This depraved scheme was a direct insult to England's highest nobility. Mary Howard was the official daughter-in-law of King Henry VIII. She fiercely refused to be degraded into a physical commodity. Her refusal to bow to the filth of her father and brother left her completely isolated. Ultimately, this exact defiance turned her into the witness who sent her own brother to the executioner's block. In the 1520s, Tudor regime high nobility operated as aggressive political conglomerates rather than traditional families. The Howard dynasty stood at the absolute top of this conservative power structure. They derived their massive influence from vast territorial wealth and an ancient aristocratic pedigree. Most ruthlessly, they used their own children as disposable diplomatic weapons to secure their grip on the crown. Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk, managed this faction with the cold calculation of an autocrat. He lacked any standard parental attachment, viewing his children strictly as high-yield political tools. His primary goal was to maximize Howard influence over King Henry VIII. Within this strictly transactional household, female autonomy and personal consent simply did not exist. Mary Howard's birth in 1519 was processed by her family strictly as the arrival of a new diplomatic advantage. Her sharp intellect, pristine pedigree, and striking appearance were quickly recognized as exceptionally marketable traits. In the 16th century, these attributes were never a woman's personal property. Patriarchal authorities treated them as high-grade currency to be traded on the Tudor political market. Mary endured a rigorous education designed to produce a flawless, compliant courtier rather than an independent thinker. Tutors trained her in subtle rhetoric, teaching her to use language for flattery and intelligence gathering. She mastered courtly dances and musical instruments to boost her aesthetic value in competitive social settings. Norfolk deliberately weaponized his daughter's formative years to place her inside the king's inner circle. The Tudor state enforced this vulnerability through the legal doctrine of coverture, which denied women any independent legal identity. From birth, a woman's existence was legally erased and absorbed by her father. She could not own property, initiate lawsuits, or sign binding contracts. Marriage was the only way out, merely transferring legal ownership of the woman from her father to her husband. Mary was fully cognizant that her physical freedom, her intellectual capabilities, and her geographic mobility were entirely controlled by the Duke of Norfolk. She possessed no financial independence and no statutory mechanism to refuse a marital arrangement. This state of enforced legal paralysis guaranteed that when Norfolk identified the optimal target for dynastic expansion, Mary would possess no structural capacity to resist the transaction. She was a perfectly engineered, legally trapped daughter awaiting her father's strategic directive. By the early 1530s, the geopolitical environment of the English central government was entering a phase of extreme volatility. King Henry VIII, increasingly paranoid and frustrated by his inability to secure a legitimate male heir with Queen Catherine of Aragon, was initiating the unprecedented legal mechanisms that would eventually rupture the entire ecclesiastical infrastructure of the state. Observing this macro-political instability, the Duke of Norfolk identified a distinctly anomalous, exceedingly valuable target for his daughter's marital deployment. The target was Henry Fitzroy. Fitzroy's demographic profile was thoroughly irregular. He was the product of a documented extramarital relationship between King Henry VIII and a courtier named Elizabeth Blount. Despite being born completely out of wedlock, Fitzroy occupied a fiercely protected, unprecedented classification within the Tudor hierarchy. He was the single illegitimate offspring that the king ever formally acknowledged. The monarch's psychological fixation on the boy was immense, and this favoritism translated directly into massive structural elevation. Henry VIII bypassed all established aristocratic protocols, transferring vast territorial wealth to Fitzroy and officially elevating him to the dual titles of Duke of Richmond and Somerset. In the strict semiotics of English peerage, these specific ducal titles were historically restricted exclusively to legitimate princes of the royal bloodline. For the Howard faction's intelligence apparatus, this elevation signaled a strongly probable, deeply disruptive legislative maneuver. Rumors and analytical projections within the court strongly suggested that King Henry VIII was actively constructing the legal groundwork to formally legitimize Fitzroy, positioning the illegitimate son as the official statutory heir to the English throne. Recognizing the massive geopolitical implications of Fitzroy's potential legitimization, the Duke of Norfolk executed his masterstroke. In 1533, utilizing his absolute legal authority over his daughter, Norfolk finalized the marital contract between his 14-year-old child and the 14-year-old Duke of Richmond. In the reality of the human life cycle, 14 is an age defined by profound developmental innocence. A subject at this age lacks the maturity or the legal agency to comprehend the severe, lifelong logistical and physical implications of an aristocratic marriage. However, personal comprehension and readiness were entirely irrelevant to the corporate objectives of the Howard dynasty. Mary Howard was draped in heavily weighted, jewel-encrusted, high-status textiles and physically maneuvered to the altar. The transaction was finalized. The Howard faction appeared to have secured absolute geopolitical dominance. Norfolk's niece, Anne Boleyn, currently occupied the throne as queen consort, and his daughter Mary was now legally integrated into the immediate royal family as the king's daughter-in-law, bonded to the male heir most likely to inherit the crown. Mary had been successfully utilized, her youth and autonomy traded to secure the absolute apex of English power for her patriarch. However, the entire architecture of Tudor power was hyper-dependent on human fragility. The massive legal agreements, the transfer of territorial wealth, and the geopolitical alliances were entirely predicated on the physiological viability of the individuals involved. The Howard faction had calculated every political variable, but they possessed no control over the sudden catastrophic onset of a fatal disease. Just 3 years after Mary was draped in jewels and paraded to the altar, her meticulously planned future collapsed. In July 1536, the 17-year-old Duke of Richmond was struck by a violent and aggressive onset of pulmonary tuberculosis. The disease ravaged the young man's lungs with terrifying speed. Within a matter of weeks, his health rapidly deteriorated, extinguishing his life and completely shattering the Howard dynasty's carefully laid plans. The sudden death of the king's illegitimate son generated a massive shockwave through the Tudor court, but for Mary Howard, the impact was intensely localized and structurally catastrophic. At the age of 17, her demographic classification was violently shifted from royal daughter-in-law to dowager duchess. She was thrust into the strictly regulated protocols of aristocratic mourning before she had secured the single requirement necessary to guarantee her permanent independence, the production of a male heir. In the strategic matrix of 16th century dynastic politics, an aristocratic female derived her continuing value either from her uncontracted status, allowing her to be utilized in a new diplomatic merger, or from her status as the mother of a high-ranking male heir, granting her the authority of a matriarch. By becoming a childless widow at 17, Mary's immediate political utility to the Howard faction dropped to zero. More critically, her legal and financial vulnerability immediately attracted the predatory attention of the central government. The sheer magnitude of the legal assault orchestrated against Mary Howard is exposed through the ruthless jurisprudential mechanisms that governed female capital in early modern England. Upon the execution of an aristocratic marriage, the doctrine of coverture legally erased the independent identity of the woman, transferring total ownership of her person and any accompanying assets to the husband. However, to prevent aristocratic widows from becoming financial liabilities upon the death of their spouses, common law required the activation of a jointure. This was a pre-negotiated, legally binding financial allowance drawn directly from the deceased husband's territorial estates, explicitly designed to guarantee the widow's physical maintenance, fund an independent household, and provide socio-political agency for the remainder of her life. As the widow of the Duke of Richmond, Mary was legally entitled to a massive influx of liquid capital from the vast Richmond estates. This jointure would have instantly established her as a fiercely autonomous, heavily capitalized noblewoman capable of maintaining a permanent physical presence within the highest echelons of the royal court, entirely independent of her father's control. However, King Henry VIII operated as a fiercely opportunistic, fiscally driven autocrat. The monarch recognized the massive volume of wealth scheduled for transfer to the teenage widow. Driven by a constant requirement to fund military infrastructure and palace construction, the king initiated a calculated jurisprudential maneuver designed to completely bypass the legal obligations of the marital contract, ensuring the Richmond estates remained firmly locked within the royal treasury. King Henry VIII needed to retain this massive wealth without appearing to break English common law. To achieve this, his legal apparatus weaponized a deeply invasive loophole. They targeted the most intimate, unprovable aspect of the union, the physical consummation of the marriage itself. The king officially decreed that because the marital contract had been executed when the subjects were merely 14 years of age, the union had never been physically consummated. Within the ecclesiastical and civil legal parameters of the era, a marriage lacking the physical act of consummation could be classified by the sovereign as legally incomplete. Utilizing this precise justification, the king entirely invalidated the financial parameters of the jointure. The central government categorically refused to authorize the disbursement of a single penny of the pension to the teenage duchess. This legal strategy was a masterclass in state-sanctioned structural disempowerment. It weaponized the most intimate privacy of the young woman, transforming her bedroom into a matter of state fiscal policy. The maneuver was empirically unprovable. The state could not provide forensic evidence of non-consummation, nor could Mary provide forensic evidence to the contrary. Yet because the declaration emanated directly from the sovereign, it possessed absolute legal authority. Mary possessed no statutory mechanism to contest the king's declaration. She was legally barred from initiating litigation against the crown, and her own patriarchal command structure, the Duke of Norfolk, refused to expend his remaining political capital to fight the king over female financial rights. She was entirely trapped within a meticulously engineered legal dead end. The denial of the Richmond jointure was not a localized financial inconvenience. It constituted a total systemic socio-economic decapitation. In the structural ecosystem of the Tudor aristocracy, a high-ranking title operating without a corresponding financial infrastructure was entirely useless. Capital was the sole mechanism required to lease an urban residence, hire administrative personnel, fund a protective retinue, and maintain the complex aesthetic display necessary to function within the royal court. By systematically starving her of this capital, the central government instantaneously neutralized Mary Howard's agency. She was abruptly stripped of the independent household she was legally owed. Her status degraded from an autonomous duchess capable of independent political maneuvering into a financially insolvent dependent. The crown had successfully utilized its legislative supremacy to ensure that the young widow remained structurally paralyzed, geographically isolated, and politically inert. Lacking the liquid capital required to maintain her physical presence in London or within the perimeter of the royal palaces, Mary Howard was forced to execute a total geographical and social regression. She possessed no alternative logistical option but to pack her limited personal effects and physically transport herself back to the primary provincial headquarters of the Howard faction, the massive, imposing country estate of Kenninghall. This spatial relocation represented the absolute restoration of patriarchal jurisdiction over her life. By returning to Kenninghall, her brief proximity to independence evaporated. She was immediately thrust back under the total suffocating administrative control of the men who viewed her exclusively as a deployable asset: her father, the Duke of Norfolk, and her brother Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey. A forensic profile of the Earl of Surrey reveals a severely volatile, exceptionally arrogant aristocratic operator. While possessing significant rhetorical and literary capabilities, Surrey's psychological architecture was defined by an inflated, almost delusional assessment of his own dynastic proximity to the crown. He operated with extreme impulsivity and possessed a documented history of severe physical and verbal aggression against subordinates. For Mary, returning to Kenninghall meant stepping into a severely toxic containment zone. Her daily physical mobility, her social interactions, and her basic survival were once again entirely dependent on the financial patronage of a father who utilized her as currency and a brother whose unchecked ego constantly destabilized the internal household environment. This environment of absolute physical and financial reliance provided the exact incubation parameters required for the Howard faction's next acutely dangerous geopolitical conspiracy. The deteriorating political stability of the English state in the mid-1540s exposed the sheer unhinged extremity of the directive Norfolk and Surrey prepared for Mary. King Henry VIII was rapidly entering his final agonizing years. The monarch was suffering from severe systemic physiological decay. His mobility was heavily restricted, his lower extremities afflicted with intensely necrotic, unhealing varicose ulcers that generated constant acute neurological pain. This prolonged physical agony significantly amplified the king's baseline paranoia, rendering his administrative decisions wildly volatile and exceptionally dangerous to the personnel operating within his immediate proximity. Simultaneously, the geopolitical power matrix within the court was undergoing a rapid hostile realignment. The traditionalist conservative Catholic faction commanded by the Howards was experiencing severe personnel bleed. They were being systematically outmaneuvered by a fiercely aggressive, newly capitalized reformist network led by the Seymour family, specifically Edward Seymour, the maternal uncle of the king's sole legitimate male heir, Prince Edward. The Duke of Norfolk and the Earl of Surrey possessed sufficient analytical capability to recognize their impending obsolescence. They calculated a precise timeline. Upon the death of King Henry VIII, the minority council of the young King Edward VI would be immediately and totally monopolized by the Seymours. For the Howard dynasty, this transition did not merely represent a loss of administrative influence or a reduction in royal patronage. It represented an acute existential threat. The Seymours would possess the statutory authority to initiate legal purges, targeting the Howards for execution, to eliminate rival factions and consolidate regency power. Norfolk and Surrey were operating under a state of severe geopolitical panic. They required an immediate, crucially effective countermeasure to neutralize the Seymour threat before the monarch expired. Standard political maneuvering within Parliament or the Privy Council was deemed too slow and structurally inefficient to halt the Seymour advancement. The Howard patriarchs required a direct, unmediated vector into the king's inner circle. They needed a mechanism to manipulate the sovereign's paranoia from the most intimate spatial perimeter possible, bypassing the Seymours' bureaucratic blockades. Surveying their available assets within the Kenninghall containment zone, Norfolk and Surrey identified the exact tool required to execute this infiltration. They looked at the young, highly educated, physically attractive, and financially dependent widow residing under their roof. Mary Howard was about to receive a directive that would completely shatter the illusion of familial protection, pushing her to the outermost limit of moral and legal endurance. The strategy devised by Norfolk and Surrey was directly inspired by the workings of the French royal court. In France, prominent women who held the king's deepest trust, such as the Duchess of Étampes, often possessed significant political influence. By relying on their close personal bond with the monarch, these women could bypass traditional administrative councils, allowing them to directly shape state policy and share vital intelligence at the highest level. The Howard patriarchs intended to replicate this exact architecture within the English state. They summoned Mary Howard into a tightly restricted coordination space and issued a direct, non-negotiable patriarchal command. She was to immediately deploy her youth, her beauty, and her rhetorical conditioning to actively seduce the rapidly decaying King Henry VIII. Their demand was explicit and horrifying. Mary was to establish herself as the king's most intimate mistress, using her body to secure his trust and poison his mind against their political rivals. Once dependency was secured, she was to utilize periods of physical vulnerability to transmit fabricated, deeply toxic intelligence regarding the Seymour faction directly into the king's paranoid mind. The ultimate goal was to manipulate the sovereign into authorizing a preemptive legal purge, effectively utilizing Mary to trigger the execution of their political rivals. To her father and brother, Mary was not a daughter or sister. She was a strictly specialized, disposable weapon. The true systemic horror of this directive is exposed only when subjecting the plan to a rigorous analysis of 16th century ecclesiastical and civil jurisprudence. Mary Howard had been legally contracted to Henry Fitzroy, the biological son of King Henry VIII. Under the strict, immutable laws of consanguinity and affinity maintained by both the Catholic Church and the newly established Church of England, the execution of this marital contract fundamentally altered Mary's legal relationship to the monarch. In the eyes of the law, King Henry VIII was her father. Therefore, the family's command to pursue a deeply personal relationship with the king carried grave legal risks. It crossed strict and forbidden boundaries of kinship. This was not simply a minor religious error, it was a direct violation of the ancient and foundational laws of Leviticus. The historical irony of this situation remains profound. King Henry VIII had previously divided Europe and broken ties with the Vatican. He had sparked a massive domestic revolution for one specific reason. His first marriage to Catherine of Aragon was argued to have violated those exact same rules of kinship. The king himself had established that such close family unions were a severe offense, believed to bring divine ruin upon the entire nation. If Mary complied with her father's directive, she would be exposing herself to total spiritual damnation and extreme legal peril. Should the king's wildly volatile paranoia shift, or should the Seymour faction discover the infiltration, Mary could be immediately prosecuted for incest, witchcraft, or treason. Her patriarchal commanders were actively ordering her to step into the most dangerous, morally bankrupt legal abyss in the kingdom, utilizing her life as a disposable shield for their own dynastic survival. Norfolk and Surrey calculated that Mary's absolute financial dependency, resulting from the state's denial of her jointure, would guarantee her immediate compliance. They operated on the assumption that the threat of expulsion from Kenninghall, which equated to total destitution and probable starvation, would override any internal moral hesitation. This calculation fundamentally failed to account for the structural rigidity of Mary Howard's internal moral architecture. Faced with a mandate that required the total annihilation of her bodily autonomy, her spiritual standing, and her legal safety, Mary executed an unprecedented administrative maneuver for a 16th century female dependent, the absolute negative. When the state intelligence operatives later recorded the forensic data of this specific confrontation, they documented the exact parameters of her refusal. Mary Howard did not deploy standard rhetorical evasion. She locked visual contact with the primary commanders of her faction and stated unequivocally that she would rather cut her own throat than participate in the conspiracy. This statement must be analyzed strictly as a precise declaration of physical sovereignty. Mary was formally notifying the Howard patriarchs that she preferred the immediate, self-inflicted end of her life over the forced, state-level prostitution of her body. She computed the cost-benefit analysis. Compliance meant total degradation and highly probable execution. Refusal meant severe poverty and social exile. She established an impenetrable psychological perimeter, selecting the preservation of her human dignity over the preservation of her comfort. The activation of this absolute negative generated a catastrophic, systemic shock within the Howard command structure. The Earl of Surrey, whose neurological baseline was characterized by extreme entitlement and high impulsivity, completely lost his capacity for rational strategic negotiation. Surrey viewed female morality as a strictly localized, deeply inconvenient obstacle that must instantly yield to dynastic necessity. Confronted with his sister's impenetrable moral rigidity, his reaction devolved into severe, unmitigated verbal and psychological degradation. Historical documentation indicates he aggressively cornered Mary, projecting a fiercely targeted verbal assault, actively mocking her prioritization of personal honor as a catastrophic failure of aristocratic duty. This specific confrontation functioned as the definitive mechanism that permanently dismantled the illusion of the aristocratic familial unit. In that moment of intense psychological assault, the socio-cultural facade of kinship evaporated. Mary Howard observed the raw, unvarnished, harsh reality of her environment. To the men who shared her bloodline, she possessed no inherent human value. The moment her strategic utility dropped to zero, the moment she refused to be weaponized, she was immediately reclassified as hostile debris. This acute realization severed all remaining psychological loyalty Mary held toward the Howard faction, fundamentally altering her strategic parameters for the events that would immediately follow. The survival of the Howard dynasty, already severely compromised by the failure of the bedchamber infiltration, was ultimately destroyed by a massive, unforced strategic error committed by the Earl of Surrey in late 1546. To comprehend the lethality of Surrey's action, one must analyze the function of heraldry in the early modern state. In an era preceding mass communication and digital verification, heraldry, the highly codified system of coats of arms, crests, and visual insignia, was the primary visual language of legal authority, territorial ownership, and dynastic succession. The exact placement of a specific symbol upon a shield was a legally binding declaration of status, strictly monitored by the College of Arms. Driven by an inflated, wildly delusional assessment of his own dynastic proximity to the crown, Surrey authorized a radical, unauthorized alteration to his personal heraldic crest. He integrated the specific coat of arms belonging to King Edward the Confessor, an ancient, strictly restricted symbol denoting the absolute apex of English royal authority, directly into the first quarter of his own shield. In the hyper-paranoid, heavily monitored tactical environment of King Henry VIII's final days, this semiotic alteration was immediately flagged by the Central Intelligence Apparatus. It was not classified as an artistic misjudgment or a minor breach of protocol. The Tudor legal framework explicitly interpreted this specific visual data as a direct, actionable claim to the English line of succession. By painting the royal arms, Surrey was effectively broadcasting a visual signal that he possessed a superior right to the throne than the king's own son, Prince Edward. The Seymour faction, having acquired the exact forensic evidence required to neutralize their primary political rivals, immediately activated the state's enforcement mechanisms. This was the precise statutory opening they required to execute a preemptive strike before the king's death. The Crown dispatched two of its most fiercely capable, ruthless interrogators, William Paget and Richard Southwell, to execute a massive coordinated sweep of the Howard infrastructure. The Duke of Norfolk and the Earl of Surrey were immediately apprehended. They were physically extracted from their estates and transported under heavy guard to the heavily fortified containment zones of the Tower of London. Simultaneously, the state intelligence operatives recognized that the most critical, unvarnished data regarding the internal operations of the Howard faction was located within the female personnel of the household. The royal commissioners breached the perimeter of Kenninghall and formally detained Mary Howard, She was extracted from her domestic environment and placed into an intensely pressurized state interrogation protocol. The Tudor government prepared to deploy its most lethal jurisprudential weapon against her, the doctrine of misprision of treason. The state was about to force the Duchess of Richmond to make a meticulously calculated choice between the survival of her abuser and the continuation of her own life. The absolute severity of the trap closing around Mary Howard is exposed through a precise analysis of the legal instrument deployed against her, the doctrine of misprision of treason. In the functional mechanics of 16th century English common law, treason was not strictly limited to the overt physical execution of an act against the sovereign. The state had systematically expanded its jurisdictional perimeter to criminalize the retention of intelligence. The statute of misprision dictated that any subject who possessed prior or current knowledge of a treasonous conspiracy and failed to proactively, immediately transmit that data to the central government authorities was legally classified as equally culpable to the primary conspirators. The penal consequence for misprision was absolute, total asset forfeiture and execution. By detaining Mary Howard, interrogators William Paget and Richard Southwell effectively placed her in a legally inescapable binary. They did not require the application of mechanical torture devices, such as the rack or the manacles, to coerce her compliance. The structural design of the law provided maximum lethal leverage. If Mary executed a strategy of silence to shield her father and brother, the state would immediately invoke the misprision statutes. Her silence would be legally processed as active complicity, resulting in her swift execution. The state had successfully weaponized her proximity to her family, transforming her survival into a transaction that required the total surrender of classified familial intelligence. The interrogation of Mary Howard was an exercise in extreme psychological pressure. She was isolated from all external support networks, entirely surrounded by hostile state operatives whose primary objective was the legal annihilation of her genetic lineage. She was forced to compute a deeply complex survival calculation within a severely compressed timeline, operating under the explicit threat of the executioner's block. The standard aristocratic protocol for a noblewoman in this environment was self-sacrificial loyalty. The patriarchal system demanded that the female prioritize the survival of the male lineage above her own existence. However, the Howard patriarchs had previously systematically dismantled any psychological or moral obligation Mary held toward them. Mary executed a strictly rational forensic analysis of her position. She recalled the private coordination space at Kenninghall. She analyzed the exact directive issued by Norfolk and Surrey, the command to commit statutory incest, prostitute her physical body to an elderly, rotting autocrat, and risk total spiritual damnation simply to function as a disposable biological shield for their geopolitical ambition. In that specific confrontation, her father and brother had explicitly demonstrated that they placed zero value on her physical sovereignty or human dignity. They had voluntarily voided the social contract of familial protection. Therefore, as she sat before the royal commissioners, Mary recognized that she owed the Howard command structure absolutely nothing. They had attempted to consume her for their own survival. She possessed the absolute moral and strategic right to prioritize her own continuation. She selected survival. Having executed her internal survival calculation, Mary Howard opened vocal channels with the state interrogators. What followed was not a reluctant, heavily filtered admission of minor infractions. Mary initiated a comprehensive, meticulously detailed intelligence dump that completely ripped the secretive veil off the entire Howard conglomerate. Mary recognized that minimal compliance would not guarantee her immunity from the misprision statutes. She needed to provide intelligence of such profound geopolitical value that the state would classify her as a protected asset rather than a hostile co-conspirator. First, she provided verified corroboration regarding the immediate catalyst of the investigation, the heraldic violations committed by the Earl of Surrey. She confirmed Surrey's severely irregular semiotic alterations, testifying to his extreme arrogance and his continuous vocal expressions of entitlement regarding the royal succession. However, Mary did not stop at the heraldic breach. She escalated the intelligence yield, utilizing the absolute truth as a precision weapon against the men who had attempted to commodify her. She exposed the aborted bedchamber conspiracy. Mary provided Paget and Southwell with the exact parameters, locations, and directives issued by the Duke of Norfolk and the Earl of Surrey regarding the French-modeled plot. She detailed their coordinated, strictly illegal strategy to force her into an incestuous infiltration of King Henry VIII's private apartments. She explained their explicit intent to utilize that infiltration to inject fabricated intelligence into the sovereign's mind, orchestrating a palace coup to subvert the Seymours and control the impending regency. The transmission of this specific intelligence to the Seymour faction was catastrophic for the Howard dynasty. Prior to Mary's testimony, the state possessed forensic evidence of Surrey's heraldic modifications, which was distinctly actionable but potentially defensible in a standard court as severe aristocratic hubris or an artistic miscalculation. Mary's testimony fundamentally altered the legal classification of the Howard faction's activities. By exposing the bedchamber conspiracy, she provided the central government with verified internal intelligence from a primary familial source, confirming that Norfolk and Surrey were actively engineering an intensely organized, subversive plot to manipulate the crown and monopolize the succession. The testimony upgraded the charge from localized arrogance to a massive, coordinated conspiracy to subvert the will of the sovereign. Mary's words effectively bypassed any potential legal defense the Howards could construct. She supplied the central government with the exact jurisprudential ammunition required to permanently dismantle the dynasty. Her testimony allowed the Seymour faction to process the Earl of Surrey not merely as a foolish poet who painted the wrong coat of arms, but as a severely dangerous, calculating operative who attempted to utilize his own sister to hijack the English state. Armed with Mary Howard's comprehensive deposition, the Tudor legal machine transitioned immediately into the termination phase. Recognizing the extreme volatility of the king's declining health, the Seymour faction could not risk the delays associated with a standard trial by peers for the Duke of Norfolk. They deployed the ultimate weapon in the Tudor legal arsenal, the Bill of Attainder. This specific legislative mechanism allowed the central government to bypass the entire judicial system. It did not require a courtroom, a jury, or the presentation of forensic evidence to the defense. It was a parliamentary act that declared the target guilty by statutory decree. The intelligence provided by Mary Howard was utilized as the foundational justification for this attainder. The bill was drafted, rapidly processed through the legislative infrastructure, and presented to the dying king for his royal assent. The act systematically eradicated the legal existence of the Howard patriarchs. It authorized their physical execution, stripped them of all aristocratic titles, confiscated their massive territorial empire, and invoked the corruption of blood, permanently disinheriting their genetic offspring. By weaponizing the truth during her state interrogation, Mary Howard had successfully navigated the lethal trap of misprision. She had ensured her own survival by supplying the exact data required to execute the legal and structural annihilation of the men who had viewed her entirely as a disposable commodity. The patriarchal command structure of the Howard dynasty was effectively reduced to ashes. In January 1547, the Seymour faction, armed with the legislative absolute of the Bill of Attainder, initiated the physical termination phase against the Howard patriarchs. The state apparatus required a distinctly visible demonstration of its supremacy over the conservative aristocratic matrix. The Earl of Surrey was extracted from the fortified containment of the Tower of London and transported to the execution grounds at Tower Hill. The executioner's axe severed his neck, bringing a brutal end to the Tudor era's most volatile, arrogant literary operative. The immediate localized physical threat to Mary's sovereignty, the brother who had subjected her to severe psychological degradation and attempted to prostitute her to the sovereign, was permanently eradicated. Simultaneously, the Duke of Norfolk was processed for execution. The state had finalized the logistics for his death, scheduling the event for the morning of January 28, 1547. However, the Tudor legal machine encountered a massive, unpredicted variable that generated a profound historical irony. In the agonizing hours between the signing of the execution warrant and the exact moment the axe was scheduled to fall, King Henry VIII's failing body finally surrendered. The monarch's severely necrotic ulcers and prolonged physical decay consumed his remaining strength, bringing his turbulent reign to a definitive end before the executioner could strike. Under English common law, the death of the sovereign immediately invalidated all pending execution warrants until they could be reauthorized by the successor. The Duke of Norfolk's life was inadvertently saved by a matter of hours. Nevertheless, he remained heavily contained within the maximum security infrastructure of the Tower of London throughout the subsequent reign of King Edward VI. Functionally and politically, the Howard patriarchal command structure was entirely neutralized. From a strict statutory perspective, Mary Howard emerged from the state purge with a pristine legal profile. She was a compliant subject who had provided vital state intelligence, entirely evading the capital charges that annihilated her faction. Yet, within the strictly insulated, fiercely conservative ecosystem of the surviving English nobility, Mary was immediately reclassified as a radioactive anomaly. The 16th century aristocracy operated on a rigid, unwritten code that prioritized absolute familial loyalty and dynastic cohesion above the statutory laws of the central government. In their functional matrix, a female dependent was expected to endure any level of patriarchal abuse, including forced incest and financial ruin, to guarantee the survival of the male lineage. By proactively supplying the intelligence that facilitated her brother's execution, Mary had catastrophically violated the foundational protocol of her socio-economic class. The aristocratic network immediately branded her a systemic threat, a traitor to her blood. They identified her as an extremely dangerous woman who possessed the terrifying psychological fortitude to override patriarchal loyalty with objective, factual intelligence. Consequently, Mary was subjected to total social ostracization. The surviving noble factions initiated a strict sociological quarantine, effectively isolating her from the residual power networks of the Tudor court. They recognized that a woman who possessed the structural rigidity to refuse submission to her own father and brother, and the strategic capability to weaponize truth during a state interrogation, could never be safely integrated into a new dynastic merger. She was too fiercely independent to ever be utilized as a compliant submissive asset. This enforced sociological isolation, which the aristocracy intended as a severe psychological punishment, actually provided Mary Howard with the exact strategic environment she required to finalize her independence. Following the execution of the Earl of Surrey and the permanent incarceration of the Duke of Norfolk, the patriarchal oversight that had previously dictated her physical mobility and biological deployment was completely eradicated. For the first time in her 28 years of life, Mary Howard possessed absolute unmediated autonomy. To secure this autonomy permanently, Mary weaponized her legal classification. Under English common law, her status as a Dowager Duchess granted her the strictly restricted legal designation of feme sole, a single woman. Unlike a feme covert, a married woman whose legal identity was absorbed by her husband, a feme sole possessed the statutory right to execute legal contracts, independently manage her financial capital, and dictate her own geographic residence without requiring the authorization of a male overseer. The standard protocol for a high-status Tudor widow of her age and physical aesthetics was rapid reintegration into the marital market, utilizing her remaining genetic viability to forge a new geopolitical alliance. Mary initiated an absolute permanent refusal of this protocol. She executed a strictly rational logistical calculation. Any subsequent marriage would instantly reinvoke the doctrine of coverture, legally transferring her hard-won bodily autonomy and financial agency to a new male controller. She permanently denied the state and the residual aristocracy any further access to her person. She withdrew entirely from the toxic, high-stakes environment of the royal palaces, relocating to the rural periphery. By strictly maintaining her feme sole status, she constructed an impenetrable legal and social perimeter, guaranteeing that she would never again be reduced to political currency. The final phase of Mary Howard's timeline completely dismantles the shallow historical narrative that attempts to classify her as a cold-blooded, vindictive operative. The execution of the Earl of Surrey, compounded by the legislative effects of the Bill of Attainder, had generated a massive localized crisis. The Attainder invoked the doctrine of corruption of blood, which systematically stripped Surrey's offspring of their aristocratic titles and permanently confiscated their financial inheritance. Surrey's young children were left entirely destitute and politically vulnerable. Their immediate biological mother, Frances de Vere, was logistically incapable of managing the logistical and psychological fallout of the state purge. The children were effectively abandoned, classified by the state as collateral damage in the total collapse of the Howard faction. It was at this precise juncture that Mary Howard executed a maneuver of profound psychological complexity. The woman who had supplied the forensic data required to terminate the father now stepped directly into the resulting power vacuum to protect his children. As the rest of the nobility recoiled from the shattered Howard family, Mary absorbed Surrey's orphaned nieces and nephews into her own localized, independent, infrastructure. She utilized her newly secured autonomy and her carefully managed financial resources to establish a secure, heavily protected environment for the children of the very man who had subjected her to extreme verbal abuse and attempted to orchestrate her prostitution. This decision was not a matter of geopolitical strategy. It was a deliberate, highly calculated exercise in trauma mitigation. Mary recognized that the children were entirely innocent of their father's extreme arrogance and their grandfather's toxic ambition. By taking absolute administrative control of the nursery, Mary shifted her entire focus from political survival to human cultivation. Within her isolated country estate, Mary Howard essentially constructed a sanctuary for the next generation of the Howard line. She assumed total administrative control over the physical maintenance and educational matrices of the children, specifically overseeing the development of the young Thomas Howard, who would eventually survive the Tudor era to be restored as the 4th Duke of Norfolk. She actively worked to break the cycle of dynastic abuse, fiercely shielding her young, vulnerable nieces and nephews from the lethal, high-stakes paranoia that had destroyed their fathers. Mary replaced the toxic, hyper-ambitious conditioning deployed by her own father with a curriculum focused on stability, psychological security, and quiet dignity. She poured her resources into ensuring that the traumatic cycle of patriarchal commodification was permanently broken within her localized perimeter. Mary Howard lived out the remainder of her life in this self-imposed, profoundly productive exile. She maintained her structural independence, refused all attempts at state reintegration, and successfully mitigated the fallout of her family's collapse. She died in 1557 at the age of 38, having utilized her final decade entirely on her own terms. To accurately assess the historical weight of Mary Howard, the Duchess of Richmond and Somerset, one must entirely reject the localized, deeply misogynistic propaganda generated by the 16th century aristocratic class. The historical classification of Mary as a villainous sister is a deliberate structural misinterpretation designed to penalize a female subject for successfully defeating the patriarchal machine. Mary Howard stands as one of the most vivid, undeniable demonstrations of female structural resistance within a totalitarian environment. She was inserted into a system that viewed her purely as a vessel for sovereign lust and a tool for dynastic domination. Yet she possessed the immense psychological fortitude to activate the absolute negative. Her refusal to execute the incestuous infiltration of King Henry VIII's bedchamber was not an emotional reflex. It was a monumental, solitary defense of her own bodily autonomy. She accepted the absolute guarantee of total financial ruin and the explicit threat of patriarchal violence rather than compromise her internal moral architecture. Furthermore, her decision to supply the central government with verified intelligence regarding her family's conspiracy was a strictly rational, precision-engineered survival maneuver. Cornered by the lethal statutes of misprision of treason, she weaponized objective truth to neutralize the operatives who had attempted to consume her. She recognized that loyalty to abusers is not a moral obligation. It is a mechanism of self-destruction. Ultimately, the definitive proof of her character is located not within the state interrogation room, but within the rural perimeter of her final estate. By opening her home to the orphaned children of her primary abuser, she demonstrated a profound capacity to execute trauma mitigation over vengeance. Mary Howard did not betray her family. She systematically dismantled a toxic command structure, reclaimed absolute ownership of her psychological identity, and utilized her hard-won autonomy to construct a sanctuary out of the radioactive ashes of her faction. She proved conclusively that even within the most terrifying, commodifying environments designed by men, human dignity can be preserved, provided the subject possesses the iron will to defend it.